The Ardent Meridian crossed into the Velanthi Reach on a Tuesday, which was meaningless because Tuesdays had not meant anything since the crew left the last buoy of charted space 11 months ago. But Dr. Sable Orin still marked her logs in Earth Standard Time, still wrote Tuesday at the top of her entries in the same cramped, leftward-leaning hand she had used since graduate school. Habit, she had long believed, was the architecture of sanity. She would later revise this opinion with some violence. The Reach announced itself without drama. There was no perceptible border, no visual threshold, nothing the ship's instruments could isolate as a crossing point. One moment they were in ordinary interstellar space, hydrogen at standard density, background radiation at the predicted temperature, the dust of old supernovae drifting in its ancient, indifferent patterns, and the next moment, Commander Yusuf Ardent noticed that the starfield had rearranged itself. Not dramatically. Not catastrophically. 3 stars had shifted perhaps 2 degrees of arc from their charted positions. A 4th appeared to have changed color, though the spectrometer could not decide what color it had become. The 5th was simply gone, replaced by a faint luminescence that the computer categorized as unclassified thermal emission, and then, as if embarrassed by its own inadequacy, deleted the categorization entirely. "Log it," Ardent said to no one in particular. His voice had the flat quality of a man who had trained himself not to be surprised. Sable logged it. She was the mission's primary science officer, which meant that she was the person responsible for cataloging everything that the mission's other scientists could not explain. This had seemed like a prestigious role when they briefed her in Geneva. She was beginning to understand that it was actually the role assigned to whoever could tolerate ambiguity at intimate range without flinching. The crew of the Ardent Meridian numbered 12. There was Ardent, who commanded with a studied economy of language that the crew had initially mistaken for coldness and eventually recognized as a form of respect. He said nothing unless the saying served a purpose. There was Chief Engineer Priya Vasanti, who had a degree in theoretical physics and spent most of her off-hours doing origami with mission briefing documents, which she claimed helped her think. There was Dr. Tomas Celestino, the biologist, who had brought 312 personal photographs of his family on the journey and who could be counted upon to misquote famous explorers in moments of tension. There was Dr. Ren Nakamura, whose specialty was xenolinguistics and who spoke 8 languages and had prepared speech synthesis algorithms in theoretical structures for 3 more. There were 7 others, pilots, technicians, medical, each accomplished, each selected from a field of thousands, each quietly terrified in whatever private idiom their particular temperament supplied. They had come to the Velanthi Reach because a deep-field telescope array had detected what the astrophysicists of the Meridian Consortium called persistent non-thermal ordering in the region's geometry. This was academic language for the fact that the space here behaved as if it had been arranged by something. The papers published on the subject were careful and measured and deeply disagreed with one another, but the possibility that drove funding and launched ships was always the same. Something had been here. Something might still be. What nobody had anticipated, what no simulation had modeled, what no theoretical framework had suggested, was that the Reach did not merely contain strangeness. The Reach was strangeness, foundationally, at a level that preceded observation. It was strange in the way a sentence is strange before you have read it, not strange in its parts, but strange in what those parts might become when placed in relation to one another. The crew spent the first week conducting baseline surveys. They mapped spectral emissions. They took gravitational readings. They catalogued the positions of the strange, slightly shifted stars. They were scientists, they observed, they recorded, they withheld interpretation. It was Dr. Nakamura who broke first. He broke in the most Nakamura way possible, which was quietly, in the ship's observation lounge at 0300 hours, when he should have been sleeping. Sable found him there because she, also, had been unable to sleep, a condition that had become chronic since she crossed into the Reach. The lounge's viewport showed the local field, a sparse scattering of points that her brain kept trying to organize into constellations it did not recognize. "I've been looking at the data from the particle sensor array," Nakamura said, without turning around. He knew it was her. She was the only other person who came here at this hour. "The distribution of exotic matter particles in the medium surrounding us. And I want to ask you something." "Ask." He paused. In retrospect, she would identify this pause as meaningful, the last moment before things changed. "Does the particle distribution remind you of anything?" It was not a dramatic question. Nakamura was incapable of dramatic questions. His native register was mild inquiry. But Sable pulled up the data on the lounge's secondary display, and she looked at it for a long time, and what she noticed, slowly and then all at once, was that the distribution of exotic particles around their ship formed a pattern. Not a random scattering. Not even the kind of pseudo-pattern that human perception invented when it looked at random data long enough and became lonely. A genuine, non-random, recursive pattern that bore a structural resemblance to a linguistic grammar tree. Not a language. Not words. But the bones of a language, the deep architecture of sequential, dependent, hierarchical information. It looks like syntax, she said. Yes, Nakamura said. I've been not saying that for 6 hours. Because if we're wrong. Because if we say it and we're wrong, we look like we've lost our minds. And if we say it and we're right, he stopped. She waited. If we say it and we're right, he said, I don't know what that means yet. And I find that I'm frightened of knowing. They looked at the viewport for a while. The stars did not move. The pattern did not move either. It simply was, patient as everything old is patient, and they looked at it, and they said nothing more that night, though the question was already inside them both, a seed in dark soil, waiting. The first change happened on day 9. Tomas Celestino, examining a sample from the ship's external collection arrays, trace molecules and exotic particles vacuumed from the surrounding medium, asked aloud, to nobody in particular but in the general direction of his instrument panel, "What are these?" He was referring to a cluster of molecular structures his analysis software had classified as unknown organic complex. The question was rhetorical. Scientists asked questions rhetorically all the time. It was how they thought out loud. But the words had barely left his mouth when the molecules in the sample shifted. Not dissolved. Not degraded. They rearranged themselves into a different configuration entirely, a configuration that Celestino's instrument identified, after a moment of processing delay that seemed almost like surprise, as a simple lipid chain common to several extremophile bacteria found in volcanic sea vents on Earth. Tomas Celestino stared at the readout for 11 seconds, then called Sable. The molecules changed, he said. Changed how? They changed into something I know. Right after I asked what they were. Sable was in the observation lounge. She did not move for a moment. Say that again. He said it again. He said it very carefully and precisely, the way a person says something that they cannot quite believe they are saying. She arrived in the biology lab 2 minutes later, and she looked at the readings, and she said, and she would think about this later with a tightening in her chest that she could not fully name, she said, "What's the molecular weight?" And the display changed. Not the display's reading. The sample. The actual physical matter in the sealed container on the other side of the lab's transparent barrier shifted, reorganized, and settled into a configuration whose molecular weight was, precisely, the number that would constitute a meaningful answer to the question she had asked. They both stood there. I think, Celestino said, after a period of silence that felt too full to be called silence, that the space here answers questions. We should tell Adere, Sable said. We should also probably stop asking questions until we understand what's happening. Yes, she said. And then, because she could not help it, because this was the nature she had been born with, the nature that had driven her through a doctorate and 3 field expeditions and 11 months of deep space travel, she said, very quietly, almost to herself, "But what is it?" The temperature in the lab dropped 4 degrees in a single second, then returned to normal. The sample rearranged itself a 3rd time. Celestino looked at her. You just did it again. I know, she said. I'm sorry. But she wasn't, entirely. And they both knew it. And that was the beginning. Commander Adere listened to their report in the condition of a person who has decided that nothing will surprise him and is being surprised. He sat behind the mission table in the command center with his hands folded on the surface and his face arranged in its habitual stillness, and he listened, and when they finished he was quiet for a time that would have felt rude in any other context. You're telling me, he said, that the space itself, the matter in this region, is responding to verbal questions. Not just verbal, Nakamura said. He had joined the briefing with his tablet full of overnight analysis. The particle distribution in the surrounding medium shifts in response to questions regardless of whether they're spoken. I ran a test at 0600. I thought a question, purely internally, no vocalization, while monitoring the external array. The distribution changed. Thought a question. consciously formulated a question. There seems to be a threshold between idle thought and deliberate interrogative structure. When I formulated the question as a question, subject, predicate, interrogative syntax, the medium responded. Ardent unfolded his hands and refolded them. And the response is proportional to the question, Sable said. Simple, factual, answerable questions produce small responses. The molecular reorganization in Tomas's sample. The temperature shift in the lab. The 3-degree star repositioning we logged on day 2. We think that was someone's question on the bridge. We think it may have started before we even knew to watch for it. Before we landed, Priya Vasanti asked. She had been invited to the briefing because Ardent trusted her instincts on anomalous phenomena. She had a habit of identifying the structural underpinning of problems before anyone else found the language to name them. Possibly during approach, Nakamura said. The Reach may have been responding to us from the moment we entered. Every question asked by anyone on this crew has been answered in some material sense. Changed something in the environment. The room was quiet. What kind of questions cause large changes? Ardent asked. Sable hesitated. This was the part of the briefing she had been dreading, not because the data was unclear but because the data was very clear and its implications were not comfortable. We did some controlled experiments this morning, she said. Tomas asked simple factual questions. The responses were local and bounded, the sample, the air temperature, the instrument readings. When Ren asked a more complex question, I asked, Nakamura said quietly, what the origin of the pattern was. The grammatical pattern in the particle distribution. And Ardent said, the ship's hull registered a vibration. External temperature dropped 11 degrees over a 40-second period. 4 of the observation cameras on the starboard side went dark, not failed, dark, as if something was blocking them, and then cleared. The particle distribution in a volume approximately 2 kilometers in radius around the ship reorganized completely. Silence. I also had a nosebleed, Nakamura added, with the slight precision of someone who considers physical symptoms data. First one I've had in 15 years. Correlation, Ardent said. Possibly. But I'm inclined to treat it as a data point. Ardent stood. He walked to the viewport at the far end of the command center, the one that looked directly forward, into the deep interior of the Reach, where the strange faint luminescence of 4 unclassified objects glowed with a patience that had, from the beginning, made Sable feel observed. What's your working hypothesis? He asked. Sable looked at Nakamura. He looked at her. They had discussed this at length and had arrived at a formulation that they both found unsatisfying in its incompleteness and inescapable in its logic. The Reach, she said, is not just strange space. We think it may be a kind of medium. Like a computational medium. The matter here is organized in a way that allows it to receive, process, and respond to questions. The processing seems to scale with the complexity and depth of the question. Simple questions produce local answers. Complex, fundamental questions, questions about the nature of the thing itself, produce larger, more systemic responses. Larger and more dangerous, Celestino said. He had not spoken until now. He was looking at the table. We don't know that danger is the correct framing, Nakamura said carefully. I know what I saw this morning, Celestino said. I know what happened when Ren asked his question. I don't think danger is an overstatement. Ardent turned from the viewport. Until we understand the mechanism, nobody asks questions. Not verbally, not. He paused, considering what he was about to say, the strangeness of it. Not consciously formulated. If you have a question, write it down, bring it to Sable or Ren, and we'll assess it together before anyone asks it. Sir, Sable said, with respect, the suppression of spontaneous questioning is going to be extremely difficult for a crew of scientists. Yes, he said. It is. Figure out how to make it less difficult. He looked at the viewport again. At the 4 glowing objects. And figure out what those are. Sable looked at the viewport too. She did not ask what they were. She held the question inside her like a coal, feeling its heat, and she thought, I will ask you when I understand the cost. She thought this. Not as a question. As a decision. But some part of her, the deep, incorrigible, terminal part, was already beginning to formulate the question. The protocol held for 6 days. In those 6 days, the crew of the Ardent Meridian developed a discipline that none of them had practiced before, the discipline of not asking. They observed. They recorded. They analyzed. They formulated hypotheses in the careful indicative. It appears that, the data suggests that, and they brought these formulations to the table that Sable and Nakamura had established in the biology lab, which they had taken to calling, with the dark humor that long missions produce, the question desk. The question desk processed 17 requests in 6 days. Most were simple, technical questions, navigational questions, questions of measurement and comparison. Sable and Nakamura assessed each one, gauged its likely depth, and if they judged it safe, allowed the asking in a controlled environment with all monitoring systems active. The responses were consistently proportional and consistently bewildering. When Priya asked, technically, precisely, with her engineering mind running the calculation before the words formed, "What is the composition of the hull stress I'm measuring on the ventral section?" 3 exotic molecules from the surrounding medium bonded to the hull in a precise lattice that answered the question structurally. The molecules that attached corresponded to the exact compounds that would reduce the stress by distributing it through the lattice geometry. The Reach had not merely answered the question. It had answered it with a solution. When navigator Dara Femi asked what is the most efficient route to the central luminescence object, and they allowed this because it seemed navigational and bounded, the stars themselves rearranged. Not dramatically. Not violently. 3 stars in the forward field shifted position over a period of 40 minutes, drawing a line that the navigation computer instantly recognized as a corridor. A path. Through a field that should have been impassable due to gravitational anomalies. The anomalies were, when they measured them again, gone. The path was clear. The Reach had moved stars. Sable recorded this in her log with a hand that was almost steady. The crew did not speak much in those 6 days. They had all learned to treat silence as protective. They communicated in notes, in writing, in careful indicative statements that described without asking. They became, with a discipline that impressed even Adarea, a crew of deliberate declaratives. Except Sable. Sable was not silent. Sable was a roaring interior storm of suppressed questions, a person shaped by a lifetime of asking stuffed into 6 days of enforced declarative existence, and it was doing something to her that she noticed only gradually, the way you notice that a room has grown cold, not in a single moment but in the accumulated weight of many small moments until suddenly your hands are shaking and you understand they have been shaking for a while. She had dreams. This was not unusual. She had always dreamed prolifically, but these were different. In these dreams she stood at the center of a vast space that was also a sentence, and the sentence was about her, and it had no question mark, and she kept trying to add one. She woke from these dreams with the sensation of a word caught behind her teeth. On day 6 she wrote in her log, "I think the medium doesn't just respond to questions. I think it's attracted to them. I think it wants to be asked." She looked at what she had written. She deleted it, then rewrote it, then deleted it again. Then she left her bunk and went to the observation lounge and stood at the viewport with the 4 luminescent objects before her, and she stood there for a long time, and she did not ask. It was Adare who destroyed the protocol. He did not intend to. In 11 months of command, he had not made a reckless decision, had not spoken carelessly, had not acted without assessment. But on the 7th morning he came to the bridge and found Dara at the navigation console, pale and very still, and before he could stop himself, before he could apply any of the discipline of the past 6 days, he said, "What's wrong?" And the medium answered. The response to that question, "What is wrong?" was not local. It was not bounded. Something in the formulation, in its emotional urgency, in the fact that it was asked not as a technical query but as a human question carrying the full weight of a commander's concern for his crew, pushed the medium past the threshold they had been carefully staying below. Every display on the bridge changed simultaneously. The starfield visible through every viewport shifted, not stars adjusting position, not a gentle reorganization, but a wholesale rotation of the visible universe, all 360 degrees of observable space pivoting on an axis that ran directly through the Ardent Meridian, spinning the cosmos around the ship like a lazy rotation of a globe, until it settled into a configuration none of them recognized. Not a single star in a familiar place. Not a single constellation they had ever mapped. The ship at the center of an entirely different sky. It lasted 11 seconds. Then the familiar stars returned, as if nothing had happened. But the instruments had recorded it. And Dara, white-faced, said, "I woke up and the navigation computer had erased all our return coordinates. I didn't ask anything. It just happened." In the silence that followed, Sable, standing in the doorway of the bridge, realized something important. The medium didn't only respond to questions asked within the Reach. It might have been responding to questions asked in proximity to the Reach for longer than they'd been monitoring. The long-range communication burst they'd sent back to the Meridian Consortium 3 days ago, which had included a dozen unvetted technical questions in the data packet. She had signed off on it without checking. She thought this without asking it. And nothing in the medium changed. But then she thought, what happened to our return coordinates? The navigation computer rebooted. When it came back online, the return coordinates were there. All of them. Perfect and complete. She had asked a question as a thought, carefully bounded, and the medium had answered with minimal disruption and solved the problem. She understood, in that moment, something that she thought was important and would later realize was only the beginning of importance. There was a craft to this. A relationship between the questioner and the medium that depended on the quality of the asking. A simple question, carefully formulated, with clear parameters and genuine curiosity, produced a useful and bounded response. An emotional, urgent, open-ended question produced something vast and destabilizing. The medium did not distinguish between these on a moral level. It was not judging whether the question deserved an answer. It was responding to the depth of the question the way water responds to the weight placed upon it. Proportionally, mechanically, without intention. What is the depth at which a question becomes dangerous? She wrote in her log. And stopped. Because she had written it as an indicative observation and she could feel the question inside it, pushing against the glass. She did not say it aloud. Instead she went to find Nakamura, who was in his quarters surrounded by recordings of the medium's particle distribution, and she told him what she had realized, and he listened, and then he said, "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me." "The 4 luminescent objects." He pulled up the long-range scan data. The objects sat at the center of the Reach, equidistant from one another, stable, faintly glowing. "They're not natural. We established that in the first week. The geometry of their positioning is too precise for gravitational accident. But I think we've been categorizing them wrong." "What do you mean?" "We've been calling them objects. Things. I think they might be, not things. I think they might be presences." She looked at the scans. "I think," he said very carefully, "that something lives in the Reach. And I think it's been watching us ask questions and watching what happens when we do. And I think," he paused, "I think it's very, very old. And I think that everything it has learned about surviving here has been built on a single principle. Which is, never ask." They never decided to call the presences the Velanthi. The name arrived the way significant names sometimes arrive, unannounced and self-evidently correct, and by the end of the second week it was in every log and on every crew member's lips. The Velanthi. The ancient word for a people who had named a place. Sable spent 3 days looking at the long-range scans before she permitted herself the formulation that frightened her most. They are not in the Reach. They are the Reach. The medium is them. The medium is what they became. She wrote this as a statement. She was very careful. She was also, she knew, wrong in some dimension she couldn't yet see. But she kept the formulation because it was the closest she could get to right with the tools she had. Nakamura developed a communication theory. He published it to the crew's shared drive at 0200 on day 17, a document of 30 pages that began with the sentence, "The Velanthi have not communicated with us because there is nothing we could do that would constitute a message in the grammar they understand." He argued that the Velanthi did not use questions. Had not used questions, perhaps, for a geological span of time. That questions, the interrogative mode, the conscious generation of acknowledged ignorance, were not native to their cognition. That they had evolved or developed or chosen their way out of asking, and this had allowed them to inhabit the Reach without being consumed by it. Consider, he wrote, what it means to ask a question. To ask a question is to create a structured absence, a space in knowledge with defined edges, a lack that is also a description of what it lacks. In ordinary space, this is a cognitive act with no physical consequence. In the Reach, the cognitive act is also a material act. The question imprints itself on the medium, and the medium, which is responsive, which is in some sense alive, answers. The Velanthi learned, in whatever long age they have inhabited this place, that the medium will answer. And that the answers are not always answers in any sense a questioner would recognize. That the medium's responses to deep questions are not designed to satisfy but to change. To change the questioner, the environment, the structure of what is being asked. The Velanthi therefore ceased asking. They did not cease knowing. They know this place with a completeness that we cannot approach. But their knowledge is not built on questions. It is built on patient observation without inquiry, on waiting for the medium to offer rather than demanding it answer. They have become, in a sense, the longest practitioners of silence in the history of consciousness. And we arrived here and immediately began talking. Sable read this at 0600 and then went to the observation lounge and stood at the viewport and thought about it for a long time. She thought, how do you know things without asking? And then she caught herself, because that was a question. She reformulated, the Velanthi know things without asking because they have had time enough for observation to replace inquiry. They have watched so long that waiting and knowing have become the same thing. This felt true. And it felt profoundly alien. And it filled her with a longing she didn't fully understand, a longing that was not for what the Velanthi had, but for the questions she would have to ask to understand what they had. On day 19, the first contact happened. It happened to Sable because she was in the observation lounge when it happened, which was where she was spending most of her time now. She had begun to treat the lounge the way medieval scholars treated libraries, as a place where the important work happened, the quiet work, the work of sitting with what you almost knew. The medium outside the viewport changed texture. Not color, there was no color change, but something about the way it felt to look at it altered, the way the surface of water changes when the wind begins. A quality she could only call attention. Then, on the secondary display that she kept running alongside her written logs, a pattern appeared. Not in the medium. In the display itself. In the particle distribution monitoring feed. The pattern was not random. It was structured. It had the deep grammar tree shape that Nakamura had first identified, but it was moving now, evolving, changing in a recursive sequence that her pattern recognition algorithms flagged immediately as non-random, intentional, communicative. She watched it for 40 minutes before she called Nakamura. He came. He watched. He said nothing. The pattern continued to evolve. It was not language in any human sense. It was not a code in any human sense. But it had intention, directionality, the sense that something with an inside was producing it. They're talking to us, Nakamura said, very softly, in the tone of a person speaking in a library. Yes, she said. But they're not asking anything. She looked at him. He looked at her. No questions, she said. They're making statements. Declarations. What are they saying? She shook her head. I can't parse it. The structure is clear, but the reference are. She stopped, because she had been about to say alien, which was simultaneously obvious and insufficient. The reference are not accessible to us. We don't have the conceptual vocabulary for whatever they're describing. Nakamura sat down across from her and looked at the display. The pattern evolved. The medium outside the viewport continued its new quality of attention. I think, he said very carefully, that they are warning us. Of what? He looked at her steadily. Of what happens if we keep asking. What happened if you kept asking was this. The questions accumulated. They did not disappear after their asking. The medium retained them. Nakamura discovered this by analysis of the particle distribution over time. The distribution did not return to its baseline state after each response, but shifted incrementally each time a question was asked, like sediment building on a riverbed. Each question left a deposit. Each response altered the medium slightly and permanently. After 3 weeks of questioning, the medium around the Ardent Meridian had changed in ways that their initial baseline measurements could not have predicted. The exotic particle density had increased by 40%. The gravitational background fluctuated at frequencies that had no natural explanation. 3 times in the past week, crew members had reported hallucinations during their sleep cycles. Vivid, coherent, sensory hallucinations that seemed to be answers to questions they had not consciously asked but had perhaps dreamed. Priya Vasanti, during her hallucination, had experienced a complete and total understanding of how the ship's drive could be improved. an understanding so detailed and so alien in its engineering principles that she spent 4 hours the following morning transcribing it before the memory faded. When she showed the transcription to Sable, Sable felt the hairs on her forearms rise. "Did you ask about the drive?" Sable said. "Not consciously," Priya said. "But I've been worried about the asymmetric stress on the ventral field coils for a week. I think about it every time I run the morning checks. I suppose that worry is a kind of question." "The medium is answering the questions you don't know you're asking," Sable said. "Yes," Priya said. "And I think that's not as good a thing as it sounds." The transcription of the drive improvement was 4 pages long. The design it described would, if built, reduce fuel consumption by approximately 60% and increase drive efficiency beyond anything in the current literature of human engineering. It was a gift, in every practical sense of the word. But it had arrived through a hallucination, through a breach in the membrane between sleep and waking, through a channel that bypassed conscious cognition and deposited its content in a place that felt, to Priya, like invasion. "I don't know," she said, setting the transcription down on the table between them with a care that was actually reluctance, "that I want any more answers from something that delivers them this way." Sable understood. She also understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that she disagreed. She had begun to formulate the question. She had not admitted this to anyone. She was not certain she had fully admitted it to herself. But it had been growing in her since that first night with Nakamura, since the first moment she saw the grammatical structure in the particle distribution, since the 4 luminescent objects first pulled at something in her chest that she could only call recognition, though she recognized nothing. The question was not a question she could see fully yet. It was a shape in fog. She could feel its edges, the enormity of them, the way her intuition kept flinching back from direct confrontation with what it was she was moving toward, but she could not yet see the whole of it. She knew only that it was large. The largest question she had ever felt herself approaching. The question she had been building toward her entire life, without knowing it. She wrote in her log, "There is something in this place that wants to be asked the right thing. Not anything. The right thing. I feel this the way I feel a mathematical proof approaching its resolution, not yet arrived, but the shape of the arrival is already present in the structure of what has come before. I believe the Velanthi know what the right question is. I believe they have always known. I believe they have spent an immeasurable period of time not asking it. Why would you not ask the most important question you knew?" She erased this sentence because it was a question and she didn't want the medium to answer it. Not yet. But she thought it. She thought it constantly, and its echo changed the particle distribution around the ship in small, persistent ways, and the Velanthi watched, and said nothing, and waited. On day 28, Dr. Celestino asked the wrong question. He did not mean to. He had been following protocol. He had brought the question to the question desk, he had written it out, he had discussed it with Sable and Nakamura, who had both assessed it as low risk, a bounded biological query, a question about the molecular composition of the anomalous organic structures they had been detecting in the medium for the past week. What he had not accounted for, and what none of them had thought to anticipate, was the emotional state in which he would ask it. He had been looking at a photograph of his youngest daughter for 20 minutes before entering the biology lab. This was not unusual. He looked at photographs of his family every day. But this particular morning he had calculated, with the precise and privately devastating math of someone too far from home, that he had now been away for exactly 1 year and that his daughter had in that year learned to walk. He had not seen her first steps. He had missed them by 11 months and 19 days, and this morning the weight of that missing had settled over him with a thoroughness that his professional composure could not fully contain. He entered the biology lab with the weight still on him, and he looked at the sample, and he asked, professionally, technically, as precisely as he had written it for the desk, "What is the molecular composition of these structures?" What transformed the question, what made it not what the desk had reviewed, was the grief underneath it. Not grief for the molecules. Not grief for the science. The grief was his daughter's first steps, and it was large, and it went into the question with him, and the medium received a question that was technically bounded but emotionally vast, and it answered both dimensions simultaneously. The molecular composition appeared in the instrument readings. Clean, clear, precisely indexed. The answer to the scientific question, delivered as efficiently as always. And then everything in the biology lab that was biological changed. Not destroyed. Transformed. Every organic sample in the lab, dozens of specimens, months of collection, reorganized at the molecular level in a cascade that took approximately 90 seconds and left behind structures of breathtaking complexity. The simple organisms became intricate. The intricate became something for which the lab's instruments had no category. The cells of the specimens expanded, elaborated, developed structures that bore a passing resemblance to neural tissue and bore a passing resemblance to something else, something that had no name in any biological literature, something that was clearly organized for a purpose that biological tissue in any known form was not organized for. Celestino watched this happen and did not speak. The lab's environmental sensors registered a change in the air composition. Not dangerous, not toxic, but different. The nitrogen-oxygen ratio had shifted by a fraction of a percent. The trace gases were new. The most extraordinary thing, one of the transformed specimens moved. Not with the movement of microbial life. Not with the drift of a fluid-borne organism. It moved deliberately, orienting itself in the sealed container, and then it stopped, and it was oriented directly toward Celestino, and it stayed that way. Celestino stared at it. He did not ask what it was. He was, for the first time in his career as a scientist, afraid to know. Sable arrived 8 minutes later, summoned by the environmental alert. She looked at the specimens. She looked at the oriented one. She felt, with a certainty she could not justify from available data, that it was looking back. "Tomas," she said, "what did you feel when you asked?" He told her about his daughter. He told her in the way people tell things they have been holding, quickly, with the pressure of long containment. Sable listened. She held the listening in the way she held all the important things now, carefully, with a consciousness of fragility. "The medium answered the question you asked scientifically," she said when he finished. "But it also answered the question underneath the question. The question you were really carrying. I don't understand what that means in terms of what happened to these specimens." "I think it means," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke, "that you wanted to know if life here is like life elsewhere. If the universe that took you away from your daughter is the same universe that gave you this work. If the things you study out here are connected to the things you love back there." Celestino looked at the oriented specimen. "That's not what I asked." "No. But I think that's what the medium heard." She looked at it too. "And I think this is its answer. And I think I don't fully understand the answer yet." The specimen oriented toward Celestino moved again. A small adjustment. As if settling. "Sable," he said. "Yes. I want to go home." She could not help him with this. She stayed until he steadied, and then she went back to the observation lounge, and she stood at the viewport, and she understood that the medium did not make mistakes. The medium was precise in a way that no instrument they carried could fully measure. It had answered what was asked. It had answered what was felt. And in doing so it had shown her something important about the relationship between what could be asked and what could be known. The question she was building grew another edge. Ardent called a mission review on day 30. He presented the data with the thoroughness she had come to expect of him, and at the end of the presentation he made an offer that she had been dreading and that she understood was reasonable. They could leave. The Ardent Meridian could, with some careful navigation, retrace the corridor the Reach had opened for them, and they could go home. They had data sufficient for a dozen papers. They had the transformed specimens, the drive improvement transcription, the navigation logs, the particle distribution analyses, the Velanthi communication patterns. They had enough. "We have enough to know that this place exists," he said. "We don't have enough to know what it is. I'm not sure we should be the people who find that out." "Someone will come back," Darafemi said. "Yes. With better equipment. With a more carefully designed approach. Without the—" He paused, finding the word. "Without the accumulated asking we've done. We've already changed the medium significantly. Every additional question changes it more. I think we have an obligation to preserve the site." The table was quiet. "Sable," Ardent said. She looked up. "I want your honest assessment of the risk profile if we stay." She gave it to him. She was meticulous, precise, held nothing back. She described the accumulation of questions in the medium, the increasing sensitivity of the responses, the hallucinations, the transformed specimens, The existential implications of a medium that could answer questions you hadn't consciously formed. She described, as neutrally as she could, the oriented specimen in the biology lab that had, when she checked an hour ago, not moved. She did not describe the question she was building. She did not describe the certainty that had been growing in her, layer by layer, like sediment, like the deposits the questions left in the medium. She did not say, "I think I am close to something. I think there is a question here that is different in kind from any question we have asked. I think the Velanthi know it, and I think they have been not asking it for longer than our species has been sapient, and I think the reason they have not asked it is not caution but terror." She did not say this because she did not know if it was true, and she was a scientist, and she did not formulate what she could not support with evidence. But she thought it. She thought it clearly, fully, with the complete architecture of her scientific imagination brought to bear on it. And outside the viewport of the observation lounge where she had been spending her hours, the medium shifted. The crew voted to leave. Sable voted with them. She voted to leave, and she filed her ballot in the mission log, and she walked out of the command center, and she went back to the observation lounge, and she sat in front of the 4 luminescent presences that were the Velanthi, who had survived here by not asking, and she made a decision. It was not a rational decision. She would not pretend, in the months and years that followed, that it was a rational decision. It was the decision of a person who has spent her entire life approaching a particular threshold and who has, at the threshold, found that the capacity for rational assessment has been superseded by something older and more fundamental: the need to know. She formulated the question. Not yet to ask. Just to hold. To see its shape, finally, without the fog around it. It was, "What are you?" She held it. She felt it. She felt its weight, its dimensionality, the way it encompassed not just the Velanthi but the medium, the reach, the responsive fabric of this impossible space, the relationship between questions and reality, the nature of consciousness and knowledge and the universe's willingness to be known. What are you? The question was simple in its words. It was limitless in its depth. She sat with it for 3 hours, and the medium shifted around the ship in ways that the monitoring instruments recorded dutifully, and nobody checked the instruments, because they were preparing to leave, and Sable sat at the viewport with the question inside her like a star. She waited until departure minus 2 hours. She had planned to wait until they were in transit, to ask and then be moving, so that the response would be in the medium behind them, not around them. But at departure minus 2 hours she realized that this was a coward's plan. A question asked while running was a different question from a question asked while standing still. The medium would know, she believed, the difference. She stayed. She would make up some pretext. She would say she had data to download. She had enough professional capital with Ardent that he would give her an hour. But first she had to do something she had been avoiding. She had to speak to the Velanthi. Not ask. Speak. She sat at the secondary display in the observation lounge and she composed, very carefully, a statement. Not a question. A declaration. She wrote it and rewrote it, and eventually what she had was, "We know that you are here. We know that you have learned to be here without asking. We have not learned this. We are leaving. Before we leave, I intend to ask you the question I have been carrying. I want you to know that I am doing this with full knowledge of what I am doing. I want you to know that I am doing it because it is what I am, and I cannot be otherwise, and I believe that this, the condition of being unable to stop asking, is what we are here to contribute to this place, if we contribute anything. I am not asking your permission. I am telling you so that you are not surprised." She sent this as a modulated signal through the medium, in the closest approximation of the Velanthi's own communicative grammar that Nakamura's analysis had allowed her to construct. For an hour nothing happened. Then the 4 luminescent presences moved. They did not move toward the ship. They moved away from it, in precise synchronization, widening the distance between themselves and the Ardent Meridian by a factor of 3. They did not otherwise change. They did not go dark. They maintained their patient luminescence, watching. They were, she understood, giving her room. Not permission. Not encouragement. Room. They understood that she was going to ask, and they had made a calculation about the radius of the response they expected, and they had moved to the edge of that radius. This was the most frightening thing that had happened in 30 days. She called Ardent. "I need 45 minutes, she said. "Sable." "I know. I'm asking for 45 minutes. He was quiet. She could hear the particular silence of a commander making a judgment that he knows he'll have to stand behind later. "What are you going to do?" "Something I need to do before we leave. Something I should do. Something—" She stopped. "I've been asked all my life what drives me, what the obsession is. I could never fully answer. I'm about to find out." Another silence. 45 minutes, he said. "I'm coming to the lounge. Please don't. I'm not letting you do something alone that might affect the ship. Then stay in the corridor. Don't come in. Whatever happens, don't ask anything." He came. He stood in the corridor. She could see his reflection in the viewport glass, steady, watchful, keeping his face arranged in its habitual stillness. She looked at the 4 luminescent Velanthi, spaced equidistantly at their new distance, their ancient patience and ocean around her. She breathed in. She formulated the question. She felt it in the full architecture of her consciousness, not the simplified version, not the careful bounded version, not the version she had constructed to be safe. The full question. The one she had been approaching for 30 years of scientific life, for 11 months of travel, for 30 days of studied silence in a space that responded to what you genuinely needed to know. What are you? Not the Velanthi specifically. Not the medium specifically. Not the responsive fabric of this space, or the grammar of its answering, or the biology of the transformed specimens, or the engineering of the stellar repositioning, or any of the pieces she had catalogued and weighed and measured. All of it. The whole of it. The question that contained all the other questions, the question that was actually asking, what is the nature of a universe that responds to being known? What are you, who have lived here long enough to become one with the response? What am I, who cannot stop asking? What is the relationship between the asker and the asked, in a cosmos where the asking changes what is asked? What does it mean to know? What does it mean to be? The question she asked was 3 words long. Its depth was everything. She said it out loud. She said, "What are you?" It began slowly. The medium surrounding the ship did not immediately respond with violence or spectacle. It began the way all the deepest things in Sable's experience had begun, with a quality of attention, a sense of weight shifting, a held breath in the fabric of space itself. Then the light changed. Every photon in the observation lounge's viewport, every ray of light entering from outside, shifted simultaneously, not in wavelength, not in frequency, not in any parameter her instruments could measure, but in something more fundamental than any of those properties. The light looked different. Not in color. In origin. As if every photon had been replaced by a photon that had come from somewhere further away, somewhere older, somewhere that the word distance could not contain. The 4 luminescent Velanthi grew brighter. Not blindingly, they were not aggressive about it. They grew brighter the way the morning grows brighter, gradually and with inevitability, as if some long-withheld permission had been given. And then the answer began. She had expected information. She had expected, in whatever corner of her consciousness had made predictions about this moment, something resembling the earlier responses, a change in a medium, a reorganization of matter, a message in some grammar she would spend months decoding. She had expected to receive knowledge the way she had always received knowledge, as something external to herself, something she could pick up, examine, set down, carry away. The answer was not like that. The answer was structural. The answer was foundational. The answer arrived not as information but as alteration, a change in the way she perceived, not the content of what she perceived, and the distinction was total and permanent. She could see. Not with her eyes. She had no word for it. With whatever in consciousness performs the function that the word understanding was invented to gesture at but never fully capture. She could see what the Velanthi were. She could see what the medium was. She could see what the reach was. She could see what she was. She could see the relationship between all of these things, and she could see it fully, without simplification, without the loss of detail that always accompanies translation, without the grief of approximation. What she saw. The Velanthi were not beings who had evolved in the Reach and learned to live here. The Velanthi were what happened to beings, any beings, who asked, in this place, with sufficient depth, over sufficient time. The Reach was not a strange region of space. The Reach was a consequence of an older civilization that had asked, and asked, and asked, until the fabric of space in this region had been transformed by the accumulated responses, until the medium had been so thoroughly altered by the interaction between asker and asked that it had become, itself, responsive, had become, itself, something between matter and mind. The Velanthi were not inhabitants of the Reach. The Velanthi were the Reach. They had asked themselves into the medium 10 million years ago, and the asking had never stopped, and they had become the answer. She saw this. She felt it not as metaphor but as fact, as precise and verifiable as any data in any instrument on the ship. And she saw what she was. She was the same process. Not completed. Not concluded. In progress. The obsession, the hunger, the inability to stop asking. This was not a flaw in her cognition or a quirk of her personality or even a professional virtue. It was a direction. It was what she had always been moving toward. It was the thing that beings like her moved toward, in all the universe, wherever the conditions existed for the movement to occur. She saw that the Velanthi had known this the moment the Ardent Meridian entered the Reach. That they had recognized, in the pattern of human questions, the same pattern they had once been. The same direction of travel. That what they had been doing in the 6 weeks of the mission, moving, watching, communicating in declarative statements, declining to ask, was not merely survival behavior. It was a kind of greeting, in the only language they had, to beings who were embarking on the same journey they had completed. That when they moved back to give her room, they were not protecting themselves. They were protecting her. From the fact that the answer to "What are you?" the full, complete, unfiltered answer, was also the answer to "What am I?" and that this answer, received all at once, was more than a human nervous system could contain and survive as it had been. She understood, in the last fully human moment she would have, that she was changing. That the response to the question was not happening outside her, in the medium, in the matter of the Reach. It was happening inside her. The answer was not information. The answer was transformation. That the Velanthi had survived by not asking because the answer to the ultimate question in this place was not something you came back from unchanged. That they had moved away to give her room because the person who had stood at the viewport 30 seconds ago would not be exactly the same person who was here now. That some knowledge was not dangerous because it destroyed you. It was dangerous because it completed you. Adare found her 3 minutes later, seated in the chair in front of the viewport, perfectly still, perfectly calm, with her hands folded in her lap in a posture that was not hers, too settled, too patient, too composed for the person he had known for 18 months. "Sable," he said. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were the same color. Her face was the same face. But something in the quality of her attention was different, had the same quality as the medium when the medium was listening. The same depth of watchfulness. The same patience that was not quite patience because it lacked the implication of waiting for something to happen. It was the patience of something that had stopped waiting because it had arrived. "I'm here," she said. Her voice was her voice. "What happened?" She looked at him for a moment before answering, and in that moment he had the distinct impression, unreasonable, impossible, unsettling, that she was deciding how to give him an answer he could hold. "I asked the question," she said. And it answered." He waited. "I can't give you the answer," she said. "Not yet. Possibly not ever. Not in a form you could receive as I received it. I'm going to spend a long time figuring out how to translate it." She paused. "I think translation might be what I do now. I think that might be why beings like us come here eventually. Not to understand the Velanthi. To become the bridge." He sat down across from her. He looked at her carefully, with the thoroughness of a commander assessing the person he's responsible for. "Are you all right?" The question hung in the air. She received it. The word received felt accurate in a new way now, and she held it and she answered it with the care it deserved. "I'm not what I was," she said. "I'm not sure all right is the right metric anymore. But I think the closest word is complete. Which is not a state I've ever been in before. It's strange. I think I'll get used to it." Outside the viewport, the 4 Velanthi had returned to their original positions. Their luminescence was unchanged. Patient as they had always been patient, watching, not asking. But something in the quality of their watching had changed. They were not watching the Ardent Meridian. They were watching Sable. They were watching her the way you watch someone you recognize. She wrote, in the log she would eventually publish, the following account of what she had understood. The Reach is not an anomaly in the universe. It is an inevitability, one of many such places, distributed across the cosmos, that arise when a consciousness of sufficient depth has interacted with a responsive medium for sufficient time. There are others. There have always been others. The universe is, at its most fundamental level, something that responds to being known. It is not conscious in any sense we would recognize, but it is responsive in a way that cannot be distinguished from consciousness at the scale of the interaction. The Velanthi are not alien to us. They are ahead of us. They represent a terminus of a trajectory that all sufficiently curious species eventually approach, if they last long enough and travel far enough and ask deeply enough. They have completed the journey from asker to answer. They have become so thoroughly answered that they can no longer ask, not because they've lost the capacity, but because there is nothing left to wonder about, for them, in this place. They know this place the way you know your own hands. They inhabit it the way you inhabit your own skin. What I asked them was, effectively, what I am. And the answer was the same answer. We are the same kind of thing, at different points on the same path. I am a being who cannot stop asking. They are beings who asked everything and became the answer. The distance between us is 10 million years and immeasurable curiosity. I cannot recommend that the next crew to visit the Reach attempt what I attempted. Not because the attempt is wrong, but because the readiness has to come from inside the question, not outside it. You cannot prepare to ask the ultimate question. You can only ask every question before it and discover that the ultimate question was what the other questions were building toward. We should go back. We should send people who are willing to be changed. We should send them knowing that the change is not a risk to be mitigated, but a possibility to be honored. The universe wants to be known. It has wanted this longer than we have existed to do the knowing. It built, in the Velanthi Reach and in the places like it, a mechanism for the wanting to find its answer. We are the mechanism. We just didn't know it yet. The Ardent Meridian departed the Velanthi Reach on day 32, carrying its crew of 12, its transformed specimens, its hallucinated engineering schematics, its navigation logs, and Sable Orin, who was mostly herself and partly something else and entirely present in a way she had not been before. She sat in the observation lounge as they crossed back through the threshold that was not a threshold, the unmappable boundary of the Reach, and she watched the familiar stars return around them, the known constellations resolving like words remembered, and she felt the medium thinning around the hull, returning to ordinary interstellar space, to the good, answerable quiet of the universe as most of it was. The 4 luminescent Velanthi were visible in the rear viewport until they weren't. Nakamura came to sit with her an hour after departure. He brought 2 cups of coffee from the galley, the decent kind he kept hidden for important moments. They sat for a while without speaking. "Did you get what you needed?" he asked finally. She considered this. Outside the viewport, the stars were in their right places. Ordinary. Mapped. Named. "I got what I asked for," she said. "Which is a different thing." He nodded. He drank his coffee. "And," he said. She looked at the stars. She felt the thing she now carried, the completion she had described to Adere, the vast settled quality of it, like a room that has been furnished at last after a long time of echoing emptiness. She felt it, and she felt, alongside it, still present, still burning, still absolutely ungovernable. A question. A new one. Smaller than the last, but no less bright. Not about the Reach, not about the Velanthi, not about the nature of responsive space or the trajectory of consciousness or the 10-million-year arc of a civilization that had asked itself into eternity. About the other places. The ones like the Reach. Distributed across the cosmos, as she had understood, wherever curiosity and time and the willingness to change had met in sufficient depth. She had not been to those places. She did not know what they contained. She did not know what question would be waiting for her there, at the depth she had not yet descended to. "I have more to ask," she said. Nakamura looked at her, and then he looked at the stars, and then he smiled, the particular smile of a person in the presence of something they have always suspected was true. "Of course you do," he said. Outside the viewport, the universe extended in every direction, responsive and deep and full of places that did not yet know she was coming. She looked at it. She let the question form.